Okay, welcome back. When we were on our last video, there we go. You had just listened to me tell you about the political parties, the first two political parties in the United States. So the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. In this video, we're continuing with topic 3.10, which is the new nation. This video is going to focus on the foreign policy issues that came up during George Washington's presidency. So you want to keep in mind what you can see behind me here of the political parties, because especially right here, the foreign policy is really going to center around the pro-British views of the Federalists versus the pro-French views of the Democratic Republicans. So this really dominates foreign policy for George Washington during the 8 years that he is president. So the big thing occurring on the world stage is the French Revolution. And so I know that you cover this very well in your Western Civ class. So you should have some background on what the French Revolution was. But to kind of remind you of years, the French Revolution, like the tennis court oath and the overthrow of the French government, that started in 1789. And by 1793, this is during the Reign of Terror when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are beheaded, right? And this sets off a series of events in Europe where other European nations are now going to war against the French, right? So that's what we're going to see happen here. Is France is going to war against other European kings. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they are family members of many of the other French monarchies. And as this starts, the French request from the United States some assistance. They request that U.S. ships are going to have U.S. ships blockade the West Indies from the British and to cut the British off from their resources there. And this was asked of the United States because the French had helped the United States in the American Revolution. And when they signed a treaty of alliance in gosh, my brain is not working for me, 1778, when they signed the Treaty of Alliance, the U.S. and France, it was a permanent alliance. That was the phrase used, a permanent treaty of friendship. And so France was calling in a favor. They're saying, we helped you, now you help us. And George Washington evaluates, and he says, basically, like he looks at it, and he realizes that if the United States helps the French, they're going to get drawn into a war with Great Britain, and the United States isn't strong enough. And so Washington declared neutrality, and he ordered Americans to avoid the war. So this angers the French, and it angers the Democratic Republicans, because the Democratic Republicans are feeling like the United States has gone back on its promises. So in his neutrality speech, let's see here. I might have to close this camera down. Let's just stick myself over there. In this neutrality speech, Washington says, whereas it appears that a state of war exists between Austria, Prussia, Sardinia, Great Britain, and the United Netherlands of the one part, and France on the other, and the duty and interest of the U.S. require that they should, with sincerity and good faith, adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers. Right? He just looked at this realistically and said, we can't afford to be involved in this. So as a result, he says, I have theretofore thought fit by these presents to declare the disposition of the U.S. to observe the conduct aforesaid towards those powers respectfully, and to exhort and warn the citizens of the U.S. carefully to avoid all acts and proceedings whatsoever, which may in any manner tend to contravene such disposition. So what he says right here is he's telling all U.S. citizens, you are to remain neutral in this. Why? I kind of already answered it, right? The U.S. isn't powerful enough. Also, the U.S. number one trading partner is Britain, so they're kind of afraid of losing that trading relationship. Okay, most Americans were upset with Washington's neutrality. So the most vocal of these are Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. He says Washington has gone against the neutrality. But Washington sticks with his position that neutrality was based on the long-term U.S. self-interest, and that his responsibility as president is to preserve and protect the infant nation, right? And the U.S. is an infant nation in this time period. Okay, what Thomas Paine said was, I love Thomas Paine's writing. And as to you, sir, treacherous in private friendships, for so you have been to me, and that in the day of danger, and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. Right, so he calls into question the character of George Washington in response to this. Okay, some other things going on for the United States, some things that make it difficult for the U.S. to stay neutral is that Britain still has forts in the western part of the United States. Excuse me. So Washington has said, we're going to be neutral. The British, however, want to try to draw the United States in on their side if possible. And so they're maintaining their forts. So if you look at this map behind me, this is New York, right? We can see the shape of New York. So you can see the location of some of these forts. So these are in upstate New York, over here at Detroit, also in present day Michigan, right? So there are these forts here. And what the British are doing is they're trading like arms and provisions to the Native Americans in these regions, and they're trying to destabilize the United States from within, right? So they're trying to help the Native American groups to check the U.S. expansion on the border, and they're like, they don't totally believe this will happen, but they wouldn't be sad if it did. They're hoping that the U.S. can be destabilized here. Perhaps the U.S. can be drawn into the conflict, and maybe the British can gain back some territory that they lost. So that's kind of what's going on there. So the British, like the French, asked the United States to blockade the British from the West Indies, but the British are also asking the United States to defend. The British also expect the United States to defend the West Indies. So they begin attacking U.S. merchant ships. And they start seizing about 300 American sailors, right? So they impressed them and imprisoned them, which is going to lead to the Jeffersonians calling for war, because they're going to say the British have attacked our ships. The British are in their forts on our western frontier, and this cannot stand, right? So it's about national security. It's about national pride. It's about standing up and refusing to allow another country to step all over the United States, for example, right? So the Jeffersonians call for war. But the Federalists are resistant, because they say we can't financially afford this, right? The United States financial system rests on the trade relationship with Great Britain. And so the Federalists say, no, we cannot go to war with Great Britain. We need to maintain close relationships with Great Britain. That's where our financial prosperity lies. So when we're looking here, I use this term impressment. What this means is that the British were kidnapping a ship, basically, right? So it's sort of like piracy, sort of. So a British military ship would stop a U.S. merchant ship, and they would take all of the contents of that ship on board, and then they would take control and kidnap the men and force them to serve in the British Navy. And what the British basically were saying is, these U.S. merchants have to serve in the British Navy because they are British citizens, which was a 50-50 lie, maybe. So some of them are Americans, like born and bred, and so now they are, citizens of the United States, which is no longer a British country. But a lot of British sailors were leaving and claiming to be U.S. citizens, even though they had just left Britain. And it's not like we had really clear laws on citizenship or anything at that time. So, the British are saying, hey, you were a British citizen 6 months ago, you're still a British citizen. And they were like, no, I left, I changed my mind. So this is a muddy issue. That's what this story is kind of getting at, is this is a muddy issue. Some of them are British citizens, some of them are not British citizens, but they were forced into labor sailing under a British flag. Okay, to complicate matters, France also began impressing U.S. ships and sailors because Washington had issued the Neutrality Proclamation. So France is upset because they feel like the United States had violated the Treaty of Alliance that the U.S. entered in 1778. So this issue of impressment on the sea in the Atlantic is a huge issue for Washington, because a president has to be able to protect his citizens, and you got to protect the businesses in your country, right? They need to be able to trade, and so what's happening here is the neutrality of the seas is not being respected, and it's not like there really was. It's not like today. Today we have a pretty clear rules and guidelines of neutrality on the open seas. So it's not being respected here. And then to make matters worse, how does Washington respond? The U.S. isn't strong enough militarily to go up against either one of these countries. So here's how Washington responds. Washington sends a representative, right? So he wants to avoid war. So he sends a representative to Britain, and this is Chief Justice John Jay. So he sends the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to London in 1794. And the Jeffersonians are worried about the loyalty of John Jay. They're afraid that John Jay might be more loyal to Britain than to the United States. And the Hamiltonians, or the Federalists, they fear war with England. And so what they decide to do is secretly supply the British with the bargaining strategy that John Jay is going to use, which, that makes you question their loyalty to the country when we look at this situation. Again, one thing I do in history when I look at things and try to figure out, like, what does it really mean? I try to imagine, what if that happened today, right? So let's say it's today, and our president sends a representative to a country to negotiate, and then one of the political parties sends to that country our negotiating strategy, right? That's gonna make us call into question loyalty, right? So what the Hamiltonians are doing here, though, is they really want to make sure that we do not end up at war with the British. So what emerges from John Jay's negotiation with the British is Jay's treaty. And this is an important treaty. This is one of those vocab words you want to put down. Okay, so Jay's treaty, when he comes back to the United States with the treaty, the treaty says that the British promise to remove their forts from the U.S. soil, which is going to open westward expansion for U.S. settlers. But this treaty doesn't make any mention of impressment. He didn't get any answer from the British. They didn't say they would stop impressing the sailors. The British forts are an issue, but they weren't the issue that was causing problems. So when John Jay comes back with this treaty and Washington presents it to Congress, in the especially the rural areas of the country where the Democratic Republicans are very popular, John Jay is burnt in effigy because they believe that he had sold out to the British. The truth is, the Federalist Party had sold out to the British um, because they were afraid that the U.S. would end up going to war. Okay, but there is, sorry, I flipped that too soon. There is one big effect after the fact that is actually pretty good from Jay's Treaty. So Jay's Treaty itself is viewed badly and considered somewhat of a failure, but Spain in the United States was worried about the fact that that the United States was drawing closer to Great Britain. So if you remember the map of the United States, we have United States territory here. You have the British up north in Canada, which isn't pictured here, but you can fill it in, right? So we have the British up here, and then to the west and along the south is Spanish territory. So in the United States, we have the United States, Spain, and Britain, so you kind of have to balance that influence within the Western Hemisphere. So Jay's Treaty gave new life to the Democratic Republican Party, right? It tarnishes Washington's popularity, but Spain watched this and said, we don't really like that the United States and Great Britain are forming this kind of alliance. And so, unprompted by the United States, the ambassador to Spain comes to, Spanish officials come to the ambassador to Spain from the United States, Pinckney, and they present a treaty. They say, we want to make a treaty with you all, and they're trying to balance the relationship of the U.S. with Great Britain. So what they offered in the treaty was free use of the Mississippi River for the United States. Now, this is a huge deal, huge deal, because we have people in the United States moving into this territory here. This is the West in the 1790s. And so there are individuals moving in here, but they don't have roads, right? You don't have roads going into the eastern seaboard. And so people who are growing and farming and producing raw materials, they have to use the river systems to transport things. And so what was happening is, they, especially here, Ohio River Valley, they would use this Ohio River to transport their goods to the Mississippi River. But then, because Spain controlled the Mississippi River, and mostly because Spain controlled New Orleans, the U.S. farmers here are having to pay taxes and tolls to ship their goods on the Mississippi River. So what Spain did is basically this, Spain said, you can have free use of the Mississippi River, and we will quit disputing this territory. So there was some territory here that was claimed by both the United States and Spain. And they said, we will quit disputing this territory, and the 31st parallel is going to be the cutoff. And so this is an excellent treaty for the United States because it allowed for these Western farmers to transport their goods without having to pay taxes and tolls. And the U.S. gained clear and free use of the land that Spain had been claiming as well. So Jay's Treaty led to the Federalists becoming less popular, but Pinckney's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty and trade-off made Washington look a little bit better because he had something with a better term. So this situation is not really resolved during Washington's presidency. So we get to, at this point, we're getting to the end of his presidency in 1796, and Washington decides that he's going to step down. And so as he left a warning for the American people. So what his warning said, had four things in it, basically. He says, don't get involved in European affairs, right? He says, our country's not strong enough, and it really isn't our problem. So don't get involved in European affairs, and don't make permanent alliances in foreign affairs. So he's speaking directly to the Treaty of Alliance with France, during the American Revolution. So don't make permanent alliances, because in the future, you might not be on the same side as that country, and you don't want to be obligated to act if you're not on that same side. And then he also is looking internally, and he's noticing that, there's a lot of division inside of the United States. Those political parties, or the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, are emerging. So he warns the country, don't form political parties and don't fall into sectionalism. And sectionalism means don't fall into preferring your region of the country over the country as a whole. And so what he's seeing emerge is the North-South divide, and then the political party divide. So when we look at Washington's farewell speech, the top two, the country heeds pretty well. The United States does a decent job of staying out of European affairs until around 1900. But the country does a terrible job of avoiding political parties. That ship has sailed. Washington's warning against something that's already happened. And then the warning of don't falling into sectionalism, that's a process that's just going to continue to the point of civil war in 1860. So the bottom two don't go so well, but the country listens to the top two. But this speech was written by Washington and Hamilton, and it's published in the newspapers. It has a huge influence in the country, and this is probably the most referenced thing about Washington in APUSH, right? This Washington's farewell speech, you're going to use it over and over again in essays. Or you'll see excerpts of it, or, but it really is it is the most important document that comes out of Washington's presidency, and it's probably because of the mixed results of his warning. Okay, so let me find a good place for us to sit. All right, so in the next video, we are going to be talking about the election of John Adams. So you can see right here, 1796, Washington's going to be a citizen farmer. He's going to go sit in his plantation and contemplate and enjoy his private life. And John Adams decides that he would like to be president, and he runs against Jefferson. So we'll pick up the next video here. We'll talk about the election, and then we'll be looking at how this French Revolution continues to affect policies for John Adams. So happy studying APUSH. Let me know if you have questions. Pull out your note sheet. Make sure you've jotted down specific things that go along with each of those key concepts issues. And I'll see you for the next video.